Myself, Dr. Shivkumar Biswarapur, Associate Professor, Department of Education, Karnataka State Akkamadi Women's University, Vijaypura. Today we shall discuss the role of errors in language learning, that is, foreign language or second language learning. In this, we shall study the behaviorist psychology of language learning and the view of learners' errors, cognitive psychology of language learning and the positive view of learners' errors, insights from studies in second language acquisition and the rule of errors, the notion of universal grammar, and so on. This is CTE course of IGNOU. In that CTE-01 course, that unit 11 we shall study today. So, as teachers of English, we spend a considerable amount of time and energy teaching our students to speak and write English correctly. Yet the phenomenon of learners' errors appears to have a certain resilience and a life of its own, appearing in new forms throughout school education and even accompanying learners into college education. We often feel frustrated in our efforts and keep wondering why it is so difficult to trial errors. So, here language learning is a complex process in which several factors come into play, such as is motivation, environment, instruction, etc. As for learning, it has its own features, though the process may not be very different from first language learning. It is to second language learning that the notion of error is applicable. Language learners are said to make mistakes or lapses. Error is a pedagogic notion and often becomes the object of instruction in second language education. Mistakes and lapses in first language are observed to be left unattended. However, in the context of the home and the family, in fact, the language learner, that is the child, enjoys indulgence rather than disapproval in this context. It receives all the encouragement it needs. Now let us see behaviorist psychology of language learning and the view of learners' errors. So here the teacher is quick to point out the error and appears satisfied when the student repeats the corrected for which she supplies. This is a familiar approach to error correction and the method has been used for several years. Its principles are related to the behaviorist psychology of language learning. Let us see some of the principles. Number one, language learning occurs through what is called conditioning or association between stimulus and response. Referring to the day-to-day dialogues between the teacher and the student, we can say that learning the second language, the teacher provides a stimulus through her question. For example, Supriya, did you enjoy your trip to Kanyakumari? Yes, the scenario is they are very good. The response what I got. Second one, in order to that, an association or a bond is formed between a stimulus and a response. There should be positive reinforcement or a reward. A negative reinforcement or a punishment prevents the bonding from taking place. See, for example, when the teacher points out the mistake to the student, she is providing negative reinforcement. When the student repeats the correct form after her, she provides positive reinforcement through her remark, right. Third one, stimulus response bonds a language learning are strengthened through practice in which the learner is required to repeat the correct form. This repetition is imitative. This repetition is repetitive. See, for example, in the language learnings, we can see that the teacher expects the student to repeat after her when she says, say that. Behaviorists are mainly concerned with external, observable behaviors for explaining language learning. The human child is understood to listen to the speech sounds it hears and then to associate them with rewards before it learns to produce sounds by itself. The initial association are related to sounds of endearment. There are some example sounds of endearment from the mother with the child associated with food. The child initially produces speech sounds that are random noise. When its mother responds, then the child repeats the appropriate sound for the response it wishes to have. In this manner, the child proceeds to develop stimulus response bonds which fall into a sequence of language behaviors. All language behaviors that are not rewarded are eliminated through negative reinforcement. In other words, erroneous behaviors are discouraged from forming associative bonds and only correct behaviors are encouraged. Traditional grammar teaching uses what is known as pattern practice to control the behavioral output in a language learning. Here, the learner is required to produce sentences by performing substitutions in which only a single word or phrase is substituted at a time in order that the scope for errors is kept minimal, so that habitual associations may be formed between words and patterns bit by bit. Let us see some examples. The questions and elicit controlled responses for practicing the use of personal pronouns. in English. For example, the question is like, are you studying English? The response is, yes, I am. Are you studying grammar? Yes, I am. Is Rita playing outside? Yes, she is. Here we can notice that substitution is minimal. Repetition of correct forms through control is one of the essential features of pattern practice. The emphasis is on the formation of good or correct in language habits. Errors, bad language habits are thus prevented from appearing in speech behavior. Nevertheless, errors do occur, and whenever they do, they are met with disapproval and the correct form is immediately provided for repetitive practice. Behaviorist psychology of language learning has definitely contributed to the field of language teaching in a number of areas. For example, the idea that language behavior is a composite of language skills continues to be the basis for planning language syllabuses that are specific in behavioral learning outcomes for listening, speaking, reading, and writing, which are core skills. So let us see cognitive psychology of language learning and the positive view of the learner's errors. We'll start with some dialogue. In a classroom, teacher comes with a dialogue, the students, Rajesh, Renu. So the teacher asks the Rajesh, is Rajesh coming? Renu will reply, I think. Teachers again ask the question to the Renu, you think so? Renu gives a response, yes. Teacher, we will wait for another 2 minutes. Here we can notice that the student's error does not interrupt the flow of the conversation. That is to say, the conversation does not focus on the error in any direct way. However, the teacher does not contribute to the learning process in a significant way. This will become clear that the basic principles of cognitive psychology of language learning, and to examine this, how the principles cooperate adequately in the acquisition. Let us take the basic principle of cognitive psychology. Number one, language learning is essentially a mental process of discovery or insight. So, formation through problem solving. Every language learner possesses what is called a data processing mechanism, which enables him or her to process the samples of linguistic data, input data that is received. If we consider the conversation in the illustration as we have discussed a couple of seconds ago, we can imagine why a teacher might be satisfied to carry the conversation forward but also provide the correct utterance. You think so? In relation, the learner's incorrect utterance, I think, she is not correcting but engaged in the act of providing the learner with the appropriate appropriate input for activating cognitive functions in language learning. If she was merely correcting, then the conversation would have taken another form. Here, we notice that there is no change in the topic and the student responds to the correct form as a straightforward question. In other words, the student does not attempt correcting the erroneous utterance immediately. Second one, the process of discovery is gradual. The learner does not output well formed or correct sentences in the first instance. The formed erroneous sentences appear prior to the discovery of the correct rule. At this stage, the learner is forming and testing hypotheses regarding a particular rule. This is a natural part of the learning process. The learner has to arrive at the correct rule on his or her own. While external stimuli can be supportive, it is the learner who is in control of the learning process and directing mental functions in an individualistic way. Third one, the learner uses a range of strategies to test hypotheses. For example, one of the common strategies is overgeneralization of rules. For example, the sentence, he chose a book. Here, the learner is overgeneralizing the rule for the use of past tense forms in English. Such utterances eventually disappear once the learner receives input regarding the full range of past tense forms. So, in the dialogue, what we have discussed earlier, the learner's response, I think, to the teacher question is an attempt to try out a hypothesis. Try out a hypothesis regarding the correct form. Later, the learner will have to revise it in the light of the teacher's input, I think so. So, fourth one, language learning is accomplished when the learner understands the rules or rather forms the right insights over a period of exposure to linguistic data. For first language learner, this period is the first 12 years of the childhood. After this stage, the cognitive functions are said to be directed to other aspects of the biological growth of the individual. For second language learning, it is a process of discovering an alternate linguistic code to first language and a reactivation of the data processing mechanism. So let us see now the insights from studies in second language acquisition and the role of errors. So we will discuss some of the insights from studies which helps us to know in second language acquisition, which is also very important for reviewing errors produced by second language learners. The terms language acquisition and language learning are sometimes considered contrastively. Acquisition refers to the unconscious growth of language in second language learners, and learning refers to the conscious study by them. For our purposes, these distinctions will not be maintained and we will use the term interchangeably. So let us take the important notions like universal grammar, interlanguage and learning strategies, and we will see what light they throw on learners' errors. While we would not want to be preoccupied with too many theoretical terms, it is useful to know that a lot of scholarship has gone into the study of second language acquisition, and there is a growing corpus of empirical data to support these theoretical concepts. So, the notion of universal grammar is, we'll see what is the notion of this universal grammar. Why is it that human children pick up language as well as effortlessly as they do? According to Chomsky in 1965, every human child is genetically programmed to learn language, which is a distinctly human phenomenon. Animals are said to have a communicative system which does not come anywhere close to the complexity of human language. Language development in the human child, in concurrent with biological maturation, in early childhood when the child's language acquisition device, that is LAD, is activated by the stimuli it receives in the form of linguistic data from its mother and other members of the family. The child's language acquisition device has the ability to process whatever language it encounters and to discover its structural properties or rules. The child is said to actually recognize the child, as I repeat, the child is said to actually recognize the rules of language because it already knows them at a universal level. When the child encounters a data from its mother tongue or first language, what it does is to use this inborn ability to figure out the rules that are particular to that language, whatever it be, Chinese or Hindi or Tamil. The child's language learning device is most active up to the age of 12 years, by which time it is supposed to have completed acquiring language naturally. In this context, we may observe that the family does not really go out of its way to teach the child to speak. The child suddenly utters its first word, then after some time it attempts sentences or puts words into a string. The child is actually working on the system on its own, correcting itself as it progresses. The members of the family don't really correct the child when it makes mistakes. In fact, the family is generally enthusiastically watching the child's linguistic abilities grow. Theoretically, learning a second language is not a very different process. Of course, it is a slower process because the individual cannot give it the same quantum of attention as it did to learn the first language. The individual's cognitive functions are active in other areas of mental development, and learning another language is an additional task. However, first language has an important role to play in second language acquisition by providing a contrastive system of rules. First language is viewed to be facilitating in second language acquisition. The learner is observed to depend on knowledge of first language for second language learning. When the two systems thus appear together in a mixed form, an erroneous utterance is said to result or to be outputted. Let us see the notion of interlanguage. Are language learners a community by themselves? This is what we have to put ourselves a question. Are language learners a community by themselves? The term interlanguage was first introduced by Salinger in 1972 to describe the system of grammar used by a language learner while learning and for a second language. This grammar is a progressively changing one since the language learner is testing out various hypotheses regarding the grammatical structure of the target language, that is second language, and refining the rules as discovered. The learner actually uses the rules of the interlanguage, which is an approximation of the actual rules of the target language. At this stage, the learner may be observed to be in stages of transitional competence in the target language and is still on the way to language acquisition. When he or she would have understood how the network of rules actually works in the target language. While in transition or at stages of learning, the learner depends on the rules of interlanguage for communication. Interlanguage is regarded as an idiosyncratic dialect or language learner language. Each learner is on his or her individual path of language development and therefore uses the grammatical system to the extent of his or her discovery. At the same time, interlanguages of different individuals share certain general features in that interlanguage is systematic. Learners progress systematically by constructing and reconstructing rules of the target language. Another important feature of interlanguage is that it is dynamic. Learners are continually revising interlanguage grammar as they progress from one stage of learning to another. New forms are constantly added on. Thirdly, interlanguage is flexible. Learners are quite tentative about their knowledge of rules and open to corrections on the basis of more convincing evidence. Thus, we identify a real community of language learners on the basis of common features of language learning activity. So, we shall examine the notion of interlanguage or language learner language in the light of contemporary positions regarding target or standard language. In our context, the target language is standard English. Of course, standard English is not a singular concept. It includes a range of language varieties, that is British, American, Canadian, and Indian English and other South Asian Englishes. Then again, these varieties are not homogeneous. British English itself is a plural concept and includes regional varieties such as Scottish, Irish, and Welsh English. Indian English includes regional variants of Punjabi, Tamil, and Bengali. For examples, words like gherao and lock are established Indian variants of British English. In other words, a target language such as educated Indian English is influenced by different first language in India. Further, Indian English is an expression of a lot of stylistic and idiomatic creativity. It also contains several word coinages. Much of what we consider as error is variation in language use, which is inherent to the development of English in a non-native context. So, errors as learning strategies. Why do learners do to manage second language learning? Both first language as well as second language learners employ strategies for language learning. We might, however, say that the strategies that second language learners use are more adult-like. While the child acquiring his or her first language is encountered or encouched in the context of a supportive learning environment, that is, the family, and has the facility of the natural activation of the language acquisition device. The adult, on the other hand, is in charge of his or her learning in a context where the learning environment is not altogether supportive. The child has a freer arena for play with the language, while the adult has already become a more responsible member of society and has to maintain a number of forms of appropriate behavior which do not allow him or her free play with language. Children generally start learning a second language formally after they have acquired their first language. We are more concerned with this phenomenon. According to Robin in 1975, every good language learner is prepared to take risk, seeks maximum use of opportunities to communicate in the second language, interacts with the speakers of second language without inhibition, uses study techniques to supplement learning, actively monitors learning by analyzing, categorizing, and storing linguistic features and attending to errors. Teaching, teaching careers, we may have encountered many good learners who have these characteristics. However, some of the learners are average and not quite so assertive about their learning. A number of them are below average and have an apparently passive attitude to language learning. But all learners are engaged with the process of learning, no matter what the level of engagement may be. Engaging with the language learning is inevitably a creative and constructive activity, and the occurrence of errors is evidence of the application of the learner to the task. Calder in 1974 identified three broad classes of errors: transfer errors, analogical errors, and teacher-induced errors. While learning a second language, the learner is engaged in comparison and contrast with first language. One of the initial hypotheses that the learner forms is that there are universal similarities and differences between his or her first language and second language. The learner transfer first language rules to second language because he or she is hypothesizing about similarities and differences between the two. When he or she receives data to either prove or disprove the hypothesis, he or she will accordingly reconstruct the rule. Hence, first language transfer is called a strategy that the learner uses for second language learning. Transfer errors appear in the form of code switching and translation. So this we have to keep in mind. Let us see what is code switching using both codes of first language and second language. First language here we will take Hindi and second language English. The candidate felt she should stay behind. That I don't want sabji. Sabji is vegetable. Translation Hindi to English. Tell me your good name, please. Good name is Shabnam. Shabnam. He drinks cigarettes. Drinks pita hai. That is in Hindi. Here, another reason why transfer occurs is because the learner is basically, how he or she encountering basically motivated to communicate. Borrowing from first language is a strategy for getting the message across. It is an evidence of the learner's resourcefulness. So, in analogical errors, the learner extends rules of language to second language to forms which are not similar. This is also called overgeneralizations. See, according to some scholars like Richards in 1974, learners use errors of transfer and overgeneralization to simplify learning the rules and all the various exceptions to rules. In fact, simplification itself is viewed as a broad strategy in language learning. As for teacher-induced errors, they are difficult to generalize. They are very difficult to generalize. They are idiosyncratic and applicable to particular situations where the errors made by teachers are accepted by learners as inputs. We know that learners rely heavily on teachers and consider them as authorities in the subject. Other types of strategies or errors are also listed in second language acquisition studies. For example, the strategy of word coinage, in which the learner replaces an second language item with an item made up from other than second language. Sometimes first language forms are used directly. For example, he is England retired, meaning had been abroad in England. The students garroted the principal, meaning surrounded the principal. We have considered some of the strategies that learners use in their attempts to learn an second language. We have observed that errors appear in the form of a mismatch between the learner's assumption of second language rules and the actual rule in the second language. In our discussion, we have come across that usage of the first language or approach to use the first language in the second language is somewhat interlanguage. So this approach we have to keep in mind while teaching English language. Now let us see approaching error correction. Both students and their parents and the society at large expect language teachers to attend to errors as part of language education. At the same time, we know that errors cannot be eradicated easily or completely due to several factors. Learners are varied in motivation, intelligence, background, and aptitude for language learning. Some are good learners who are quick on the uptake, and others are slow. This heterogeneity of the classroom population is a major reality. Teaching at its best can provide the learners with relevant input related to the stages of learning and generally anticipate difficulties that learners could be experiencing. We have observed that first language has a major role to play in second language learning. If we have to identify learning problems that arise because of differences between first language and second language, we need to present the learner with a comparative knowledge of first language and second language structures. Learners could thus be supported while they are seeking explanations of second language rules both covertly as well as overtly. Of course, the learner is also applying knowledge of universal grammar to understand second language rules. Therefore, sufficient data directly related to areas of difficulty could be provided. So, when approaching error correction, it is necessary to have a knowledge of types, categories of errors. There are errors of pronunciation, of grammar, of spoken English, of written English, and also errors related to stylistic and idiomatic usage. We need to give priority to those errors that we consume more serious than others. We consider more serious than others. Corder in 1974 differentiates between three stages of errors: pre-systematic, systematic, and post-systematic. At the first two stages, the learner is unable to correct errors. It is only at the third stage, when he or she has gained some knowledge of the rules, that the learner can monitor error correction. The errors at the systematic stage, that is the second stage, do provide us with the clues regarding difficulties encountered. Explanations provided could be of two kinds. One kind may involve comparison and contrast between first language and second language. The other kind is where the rules in the target language are presented in the context of communicative situations. Of course, as we have discussed, error correction cannot be applied to all errors the learner makes at one stage of learning. Those errors that affect intelligibility in communication are considered more serious and need to be addressed first. Hence, error analysis should precede error correction. Analysis will involve the description and categorization of errors that learners are observed to make a particular stage. Once we know the categories of errors, we can begin to provide them and plan suitable instruction for error correction. So, we have come across the error correction and the behaviorist psychology. The behaviorist psychology of language learning views errors as the formation of bad habits. Cognitive psychology of language learning, however, views them as strategies of learning. We might therefore consider the cognitive view as a positive one and the behaviorist a negative one. Keep in mind, I repeat, we might therefore consider the cognitive view as a positive one and the behaviorist a negative one. Second language learners across the globe have their own identities of interlanguage, which could be considered a dialect with its own special features. The notion of target language is variable. Idealized notions of British or American English as target language no longer apply in the situation of language education. Educated Indian English belongs to the family of International English and therefore becomes the target language in the Indian context. It's very important that I repeat, educated Indian English belongs to the family of International English and therefore becomes the target language in the Indian context. Errors are mismatch between rules that the learner has constructed and the rules in the target language. Error analysis and the categorization of errors must occur prior to error correction. Only those errors that interfere with intelligibility need immediate attention. Here, we have to rely on the learner's own ability to monitor language learning. Explanations may be provided, but they must also relate to the explanations that the learner is seeking. Basically, we must support the learner's hypothesis testing rather than discourage it. I repeat, it is very important. We have to rely on the learner's own ability to monitor language learning. Explanations may be provided, but they must also relate to the explanations that the learner is seeking. Basically, we must support the learner's hypothesis testing rather than discourage it. So here it is very important that error analysis and the categorization of errors must occur prior to error correction. This I repeated number of times because we as a teachers of the both mother tongue and second language should keep in mind this. We have encountered certain concepts. It's very important to focus and refocus on that. Code switching, a change by a speaker from one language to another. And we have used the word error. What it stands for? The use of a linguistic item which a fluent speaker of the language regards as showing faulty or incomplete learning. So I repeat, the use of a linguistic item which a fluent speaker of the language regards as showing faulty or incomplete learning. Next comes error analysis. The study and analysis of errors made by second and foreign language learners. Error analysis needs to be carried out in order to find out how well someone knows a language. Find out how a learner learns a language. Obtain information on common difficulties in language learning. So, what does error analysis stands for in language acquisition? I repeat, the study and analysis of errors made by second and foreign language learners. Error analysis needs to be carried out in order to find out how well someone knows a language. Find out how a learner learns a language. Obtain information on common difficulties in language learning. Now let us take interlanguage. It means the type of language produced by second and foreign language learners who are in the process of learning a language. Since the language which the learner produces is different from both the first language and the direct language, it is called interlanguage. It is very important that I repeat interlanguage, the concept of interlanguage. The type of language produced by second and foreign language learners who are in the process of learning a language. Since the language which the learner produces is different from both the first language and the direct language, it is called interlanguage. Now comes lapse, an error when speaking or writing which is caused by lack of attention, fatigue, carelessness, and so on. Mistake, we have seen the concept of mistake also. I repeat, what this mistake stands for? An error made by the learner due to an incomplete understanding of the cultural context. So, overgeneralization or analogical errors. This is a very important concept of what we have used in our discussion a couple of seconds ago. Overgeneralization or analogical errors. Process common in both first and second language learning, in which a learner extends the use of a grammatical role beyond its accepted usage, generally by making words or structures follow the more regular pattern. For example, a child is likely to say comed instead of come or mans instead of men. This oftenly we encounter in the classroom interaction process, where the child commit mistakes in usage of the second language. So it is a responsibility of a teacher not to allow that mistake to become a big in further acquisition process. So that is what analogical errors states. I repeat, the analogical errors, a process common in both first and second language learning, in which a learner extends the use of a grammatical role beyond its accepted uses, generally by making words or structures follow the more regular pattern. That's what we have given examples. Comed instead of come. That is a C-O-M-E-D. Comed instead of come. C-O-M-E. Or mans. M-A-N-S. Mans instead of men. Now let us see pattern practice. This is also an important concept we have come across. A technique commonly used in language teaching for practicing some aspects of grammar or sentence formation. Students make responses based on repetition, substitution, or transformation. What is this pattern practice? Teacher adequately follow the grammar rules for teaching grammar formation, sentence formation, or how the sentences are formed. If oftenly repeat, if a teacher oftenly repeat the grammar rules and writing the sentences on the blackboard oftenly, repetitively, students make responses based on the repetition, substitution, or transformation. That is why a teacher role in second language acquisition is very important. Oftenly repeat the sentences, oftenly repeat the rules of the grammar, oftenly repeat the cultural context of the language, so that the learner constructively learn the second language. Ultimately, our ultimately our main intention is to give importance to second language acquisition. If we go accordingly in second language acquisition by acquainting the rules of the grammar or the requisite rules of the acquisition of the four skills, then ultimately teacher will win the hearts of language learners. That's what the pattern practice always insists, that practicing some aspects of grammar or sentence formation leads to make responses based on repetition, substitution, or transformation. These three words are very important. Repetition, always repeat the more sentences. Always make them aware of the easiness in pronunciation, the simplicity in usage of foreign language. Substitute with examples. Give live examples in the classroom. And transformation, which is very important. So, hope you all understood the errors, importance of errors, and how these errors contextually and culturally helps to overcome the mistakes in acquiring the foreign language or second language learning with the help of first language and other things. Hope you all enjoyed the today's discussion, and don't forget to wear the mask and maintain the distance, social distance, and don't forget to subscribe this YouTube channel and make use of the information. Thank you and all.